My name is Olivia, and I'm 30. The air in the law office was heavy. It smelled of old leather floor wax and even older money. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loud and judgmental, marking time that my grandfather no longer had. My Aunt Stephanie was dabbing at her eyes with a dry tissue, a perfect silent performance of grief for the room. My cousin Chloe, her daughter, wasn't even pretending. She was already scrolling on her phone, probably checking the Zillow estimate for the house. And then my aunt leaned over to her husband, Christopher. She whispered, but she made sure it was just loud enough for the room to hear. The library and art collection alone should clear 7 figures. We'll have the estate sale set up by the 1st of the month. This kind of casual greed, especially during a time of grief, is something many of us have seen. Drop a comment and let me know if you've ever had to sit through a family moment that felt completely fake. I'd love to know I'm not alone. I didn't react. I didn't look up from my folded hands. For my entire life, I had been the family's fixer, the responsible one. My name, Olivia, was just a synonym for the one who handles things. While my Aunt Stephanie and Uncle Christopher were in Tuscany posting photos of vineyards, I was the one driving my grandfather to his cardiology appointments. While my cousin Chloe was maxing out her credit cards on a single shopping spree, I was the one sitting at his kitchen table untangling the nightmare of his Medicare paperwork. They saw me as dependable, A+ rated, 5-star review, reliable Olivia, the quiet, unmarried niece, the one who understood complex legal documents. I was a structural support beam for the family, essential but completely invisible, a useful piece of furniture. My role was to absorb the chaos so they could enjoy the comfort. I was the family's offset for their bad karma. They had no idea what my grandfather and I had been doing for the last 6 months. They didn't know about the late-night phone calls, not from a sick old man, but from a sharp, angry strategist who knew his time was short and his daughter was a vulture. They didn't know about the meetings we'd had in this very office with Mr. David after hours. My grandfather wasn't just my family. He was my client, the most important client I ever had. I had spent my career as an estate lawyer watching families like mine tear each other apart over mahogany dining sets and stock portfolios. I learned from their mistakes. I learned to document everything. I learned that in families like mine, love is a liability, but a notarized signature is a weapon. My family saw me sitting there, the quiet, mousy niece in a practical black dress. They saw a doormat. They had no idea I was the executor. I've been asked why I put up with it for so long, why I let them treat me like a free utility. It's a fair question. The answer isn't simple. It's not weakness. It's a complex survival strategy. When you grow up as the fixer, you learn that your value is directly tied to your usefulness. You don't get love for who you are. You get temporary approval for what you do. You're not a person. You're a function. This is the invisible chain of the survivor. It's a prison without bars, one you build yourself out of, a concept psychologists call learned helplessness. You get treated like you don't matter so often that you eventually stop questioning it. Your endurance becomes your identity. You learn to absorb the pain, to manage the chaos, to be the calm one, all while knowing deep down that you're being taken advantage of. You stay not because you're weak, but because you've been convinced that being the resilient one is your only purpose in the family. You become a living, breathing sacrifice. I remember 2 years ago I was helping my grandfather balance his accounts. He was embarrassed, his hands shaking as he pushed the bank statements across the table. "I don't know where the money's going, Olivia," he'd whispered. It took me less than an hour to find it, a series of transfers to Aunt Stephanie, thousands of dollars. When I showed him, he looked defeated. "She said it was a loan," he said, "for Chloe's tuition." I knew Chloe had a full scholarship. I texted my aunt attaching a screenshot of the transfers. Her reply came back instantly. "Oh, that was just Dad helping out. Don't make it a big deal." He was her father, but I was the one who had to rearrange his budget so he could afford his heart medication that month. Then last year, the chemotherapy. He had an appointment every Tuesday for 6 weeks. I'd planned a trip to Costa Rica, my first real vacation in 5 years. I canceled it. I used my vacation days one by one to sit with him in that cold, sterile room, the smell of antiseptic clinging to my clothes. On the 3rd week, I called Stephanie. I didn't ask her to take him. I just asked her to visit. "Oh, honey, I can't this week," she'd said, her voice breezy. "Chloe's sorority is having their annual gala, and I have to be there to help her get ready. You understand?" I understood perfectly. I hung up and watched the poison drip into my grandfather's arm, and I felt a different kind of poison hardening in my own heart. But he and we weren't just sitting there. We were planning. He saw the invisible chain. He saw how they used me. And in his final months, he gave me the one thing I never had. He gave me the keys. We returned to the present. The clock ticked. Mr. John David, the family lawyer, cleared his throat and put on his glasses. The room went silent. "We are gathered," he began, his voice dry, as old paper to read the last will and testament of Mr. Thompson. Aunt Stephanie performed another dab with her dry tissue. Aunt Tracy, my other aunt, the emotional one, was already crying. Chloe was still on her phone, but she'd at least muted the screen. Mr. David started with the standard bequests. To my sister Tracy, he read, "I leave my antique pocket watch collection in gratitude for her kindness." Aunt Tracy let out a small sob. "Oh, he always knew I loved those." To my cousin Chloe, he continued. Chloe's head snapped up. "I leave the sum of $20,000 to be used for a down payment on a home should she ever choose to buy one." Chloe's face fell. 20,000. It was a lot of money, but it wasn't the entire estate. She'd clearly been expecting more. Aunt Stephanie shot her a look that said, "Be quiet. The real assets haven't been named." Mr. David droned on listing small items. A set of golf clubs to Uncle Christopher. A few $1,000s to a distant cousin. Then he paused. He took off his glasses, polished them, and put them back on. This was it. "We now come to the primary assets," he said. "First, the Thompson family home and all its contents, excluding the library, and all remaining liquid assets in savings and checking accounts." I could feel Aunt Stephanie straighten beside me. This was her moment. "These assets," Mr. David said, "are to be divided equally between my 2 daughters, Stephanie and Tracy." Stephanie let out a breath she'd been holding for 30 years. She was victorious. She beamed, casting a triumphant glance at Christopher. She had won. She'd gotten the house. She'd gotten the money. Aunt Tracy just looked relieved. Mr. David picked up the last page. "Finally," he said, regarding the most significant portion of the estate, "my library, my private art collection, and all contents therein." Stephanie's smile froze. "Excluding the library." Mr. David looked up, making eye contact with no one. He read the next line, clear and final. "And to my granddaughter, Olivia, who was my caregiver, my confidant, and my truest friend, I leave in its entirety my library, my art collection, and all their contents to do with as she sees fit." The room exploded. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a sharp intake of breath, a collective gasp followed by the scrape of a chair. Aunt Stephanie was on her feet, her face a blotchy crimson mask. The performance of grief was gone, replaced by pure, unfiltered rage. "That's preposterous," she shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Mr. David, then at me. He wasn't of sound mind. It's obvious. She manipulated him. Uncle Christopher always, her echo stood up beside her. This is absurd. He was sick. He was confused. This document is worthless. My grandfather was perfectly lucid until his last day. I said, my voice quiet, cutting through her yelling, and he knew exactly what he was doing. You did this, Chloe shrieked, finally, looking up from her phone. You poisoned him against us. That library is ours. The will is clear, Mr. David said, his tone firm. The codicils are all signed and witnessed. Oh, we have a will too, Christopher said, a smug look sliding onto his face. He reached into his briefcase and produced his own document, slapping it onto the mahogany desk. This, he announced to the room, is his real will, dated 5 years ago. It leaves everything, the house, the library, the assets, to his immediate children, Stephanie and Tracy, as it should be. Aunt Tracy, who was still crying, looked up in confusion. But Christopher, he changed it. He was coerced into changing it. Tracy Stephanie snapped, silencing her sister. This new will is clearly the result of undue influence. We will contest this in court. We will have it thrown out. She turned to me, her eyes narrowed with pure hatred. The mask was completely off. This was the real woman, the one I had known my entire life. You thought you could steal our family's legacy, she hissed. You thought you could just sneak in and take what belongs to us. You've always been a grasping, ungrateful little leech. Stephanie, that's enough, Mr. David warned. You'll get nothing, she spat, ignoring him, her voice rising with a frantic, desperate energy. You'll be buried in legal fees. We will make sure you pay for this. You will get nothing. I looked at her, at my uncle holding his useless, outdated will, at my cousin vibrating with greed. They weren't shocked that my grandfather had done this. They were shocked that I was fighting back. They weren't angry that he'd left me the library. They were angry that I was going to keep it. I let the silence sit for a moment, letting their accusations hang in the stale air. I watched my aunt's chest heave, my uncle's self-satisfied smirk, my cousin's pout. Then I turned to Mr. David. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Mr. David, I said, my voice cold and clear. My grandfather anticipated this. Please play the video codicil, the one dated 2 months ago. Aunt Stephanie's laugh was sharp and brittle. A video. Oh, Olivia, this is pathetic. What did you do? Prop him up in bed and feed him lines? Uncle Christopher scoffed. Mr. David, this is harassment. We will not sit here and watch some doctored deathbed confession. I didn't look at them. I only looked at the lawyer. Mr. David, my grandfather, anticipated this objection as well. Please proceed. Mr. David pressed a button on his desk. A projector screen I hadn't even noticed descended from a slot in the ceiling, covering a large bookshelf. The lights in the room dimmed automatically. Stephanie and Christopher exchanged a nervous glance. This was clearly more high-tech than they had anticipated. The screen flickered, and then my grandfather's face appeared. He wasn't in a hospital bed. He was in his study, sitting in his favorite leather chair, the one I was staring at right now. He looked frail, yes, but his eyes were sharp. They were clear. This was not a man who was confused. He looked directly into the camera. He looked, I realized, directly at me, even though I'd been the one filming. I am recording this, he said, his voice perfectly steady on October 5th, 2 months ago. I am of sound mind and body, though my body is failing. I am doing this with my lawyer present precisely because I anticipate that my daughter Stephanie will try to contest my final wishes. Aunt Stephanie let out a sound like a strangled bird. My grandfather leaned closer to the camera. I want to be perfectly clear. My decision To leave my library and art collection to my granddaughter Olivia is not a new one. It is a decision I made after years of observation. Olivia has been my caregiver, my confidant, and my true heir in spirit long before I made it so on paper. He paused as if gathering his strength. I am also recording this, he continued, because I know why Stephanie will contest it, because she believes it is owed to her. She believed the same of the $48,000 she borrowed from my accounts over the last 5 years, money she never repaid, money she stole from me knowing I was ill. It was done. The kill shot. He'd said it. Stole. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning. This new will is my final sober and absolute decision, my grandfather said, his voice firm. The video codicil is legally binding. Do not try to fight this, Stephanie. You will not win. The screen went black. The lights came back up. Aunt Stephanie was still standing, her mouth open, her face a mask of waxy disbelief. Uncle Christopher had sunk back into his chair. Chloe looked like she was going to be sick. I watched them, and I finally understood the truth about them. It's what I call the power delusion of the empty wallet. There's a profound difference between having and being. My aunt's family had built their entire identity around having status, having the right name, having the expectation of an inheritance. It was a beautiful, shiny shell, but it was a shell they had rented with my grandfather's money and their social position. They never bothered to build any value inside. They never worked on being kind, being loyal, being decent. And in that moment, when the video switched off, their lease was up, the money was gone. And because they had no actual character, no internal value to stand on, there was nothing left. They just collapsed. Their power wasn't real. It was just a loan, and I had finally called it due. Aunt Stephanie made one last choking sound. Then, for the first time in her life, she was completely, utterly silent. Aunt Stephanie and Uncle Christopher didn't say another word. They didn't have to. Their faces, pale and slack with shock, said everything. They left the office not with a bang, but with a whimper. The socialites who had walked in an hour ago ready to claim their prize now looked like what they were: small, defeated, and exposed. My cousin Chloe scrambled after them, her head down, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Aunt Tracy was the last one left besides me and Mr. David. She was crying softly, but they weren't the same tears from before. These felt real. She walked over to me, her hands trembling. "He was a good man, Olivia," she whispered. "Your grandfather, he was a good man. I'm glad he trusted you." She touched my arm, a brief hesitant gesture, and then she too was gone. The silence in the office was complete. Mr. David began gathering the papers, stacking them into neat piles. He looked at me over the top of his glasses. "Well, Miss Thompson," he said, a small, rare smile touching his lips. "The library is officially yours. What do you intend to do with it?" Weeks later, I stood in that same library. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It smelled of old paper lemon oil and my grandfather's pipe tobacco. I ran my hand over the carved oak desk, his presence still so strong in the room. I could have sold it all, the art collection, the first edition books. I could have taken the 7 figures my aunt was so greedy for and disappeared. I could have let that be my victory, my final act of punishment. But I've come to learn that there are 2 different kinds of justice. There's the justice of punishment, which is focused on the past. It's about balancing the scales, making the guilty pay, and watching them fall. It brings a brief, hot satisfaction, but in the end it just leaves everyone standing in the ashes. Then there is the justice of the sower, the justice of the person who plants a seed. This kind of justice isn't focused on the past, it's focused on the future. It doesn't ask, how can I punish them? It asks, how can I build something new from this? It's not about winning. It's about creating. I knew exactly what I had to do. I walked back into Mr. David's office the next day. I have a plan for the library, I told him. I'm not selling a single book. I'm an estate lawyer. I've seen firsthand how the elderly are taken advantage of, how families like mine use manipulation and fine print to steal from the vulnerable. My grandfather was smart enough and wealthy enough to protect himself. Most people aren't. I wasn't just left an inheritance. I was left a purpose. Next spring, the Thompson Legacy Center will open its doors. The library will no longer be a private collection. It will be a pro bono legal aid firm specializing in protecting the elderly from the exact kind of financial and emotional abuse my grandfather feared. His art will be sold to create the endowment, and his books will be the foundation of our research. His legacy won't be about the money he left behind, but about the people he will continue to protect long after he's gone. This story is a reminder that the best victory isn't just about winning. It's about building. If you've ever had to fight to be seen, or if you believe in the power of planting something new from a painful past, share this story. Let's talk about what true justice really looks like in the comments.